Hey, Jan here, and what I'm going to show you in today's video is how exactly we're solving tracking for our clients based off multiple figures in advertising spend within the furniture industry. And one thing to keep in mind with tracking is that it can really suck if it goes wrong because either you're burning money and you're actually spending more because you think you're profitable, or you're winning and you're being profitable, but you're just not aware of it because you don't have proper control over your tracking. And the best way to sort of think about this is to think about it as a map. And in general, if you're using a map, let's say you're in a forest, you're trying to go from one side to the other, or you're trying to go to a specific place in the forest. Well, if the dimensions of the map are completely wrong, you're definitely going to wind up in the wrong place. And with online marketing, it's sort of the same thing because you're going to have to go into one direction for a while before you can actually know where you wind up. And then you can change the direction based of that. Because generally, anything online marketing, it takes a little bit for the data to come in, and you do need to have appropriate control over what is actually happening. And another thing with that is to sort of have in mind what kind of goal you want to have. You generally would have a goal of either having optimal profits or optimal revenue at break even. And the reason why that is the case is because those are in a direct response sort of context where the goal is to make as much money as possible right now in 90 days, in a year, in a measurable way. It's something that needs to be controlled. Whereas if you're doing branding, this video isn't necessarily applicable because tracking isn't actually that important for branding, and you can pretty much do whatever you want. And there's a fixed budget, and it just takes a little bit to actually see the results of it, like multiple years, maybe even multiple decades, to actually see the actual outcomes of the spending. So this is not what this video is for. This video is for having things actually be measurable. And one thing to keep in mind as well is the saying, which is the map is not the territory. If it would be the territory, there wouldn't be a lot of utility in it. If you think about it, a fully accurate map with all the details that are in there, etc., it's just going to be too complex to read. And because it's too complex to read, at the end of the day, you can't really make appropriate decisions because you're just being overwhelmed with all this different information. So there's an element of prioritization in here where it comes down to knowing the specific pieces that actually make a difference and how to control these pieces properly. So you can actually have a map and you don't need to look at the specific territory because, well, that's just not really how things work. And another thing to keep in mind is that at least up until Google Maps was around, up until everything was digitalized, maps weren't ever fully accurate. And it's sort of the same thing with tracking. You're never going to be 100% accurate, and I'm going to insult your intelligence here. That's just not realistically possible because people have ad blockers. It's not really the way statistics behave and numbers behave. So because that is the case, you're never actually going to be 100% accurate. That's completely fine. The goal of this video is to give you a roadmap to get reasonably close to reality without trying to be unrealistically accurate. And because you can have that, it can be a very strong competitive advantage for your company because you're just going to outcompete everyone, all factors being equal, who doesn't have this specific setup. And before we get into this, just really quick, there's one metric that people to look at with tracking and when they're measuring their results, and that is return on ad spend. Now, the problem with looking at return on ad spend is that it's not really an ultimate goal. It's something that leads you to the ultimate goal because, well, if your return on ad spend is too low, you're just not going to be profitable. If it's super high, it's very clear that you're profitable and that you can spend more. But at the end of the day, it's not really the ultimate outcome that you want to achieve. The ultimate outcome that you should be aiming to achieve as a performance marketer has to be either maximizing the profits of the account or maximizing the revenue while breaking even, if the goal is some kind of market share kind of situation, or maybe even running at a loss if it's a startup, but that's a completely different story. Here, you could have all this venture capital. For that, we would also need tracking because you're trying to do performance marketing. You're not trying to do brand marketing. And in general, with tracking, there's 5 basic dimensions that do apply to every single account that do make sense to pay attention to in any sort of case. Because if you're paying attention to these metrics in the right way, you're just going to be able to achieve the outcome that you actually want. Whereas if you wouldn't have that, things are kind of murky, everything's kind of cloudy, you don't really know, you're kind of flying blind. And because of that, you just got to miss your target. So that being out of the way, what are these 5 dimensions actually, and what makes them up? So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through list of these 5 dimensions, and then afterwards, what we're going to do is I'm going to tackle them one by one for you, walk you through exactly what makes them up, why they matter, and how to take them into account with your specific tracking model. Because another thing to understand is that every tracking model is different in its nature because every brand and every company has a different marketing mix, whether it's online, offline, etc., etc. And because there is that big difference in the marketing and the way things are structured, everyone's going to have slightly different situations. And once I walk you through those dimensions, it's going to be very clear. So what is the first dimension? The first dimension is multi-channel. That just means having multiple advertising channels and attributing to them properly. Then it's attribution windows. So within the advertising channels, you can have different time frames based on which people can convert and based on which things can get attributed to the actual ad account and how data is going to show up in the actual ad account. Another piece of this is the attribution model that's being used. It's not super easy to explain. I'm going to get into examples about this later. Another thing is knowing the actual percentage of new customers as well as the lifetime value, because otherwise you think you're getting all these new customers, but you're actually not. And the last one being inaccuracy. And that's something that can be controlled through tech stack, through applications, but you're never going to get 100% control over it. It's just something that can be optimized. These dimensions do have to be constantly monitored in order to not actually mess things up. So for example, what it means is you can have very heavy over attribution in 1 week, and then the next week you can have no purchases tracked at all. So this could be something where your technology is actually set up completely fine, but with all these iOS regulations, etc., that are being implemented currently or have been implemented at the time of recording roughly a year ago, it just is something that occurs. So 1 week you can think you're doing great, but you're actually not. And then another week you can think you're doing terrible, but in reality, you're actually getting all of these great results and you're just not aware of it. Because of that, you feel bad, you scale things down. And once things are scaled down, you're just missing the overall target, kind of like the map analogy that I mentioned earlier, if you recall. So that being out of the way, one specifically is multi-channel. So as I mentioned, this is basically having multiple marketing channels that are being used. And those channels can be, amongst others, there can be a couple different ones, but I'm just going to list the most common ones. It can be direct traffic. That's basically people typing your URL into their browser, whether it's Chrome, Safari, whatever it may be. It can be email traffic, people coming from your newsletter campaigns, but also people coming from pop-ups that you're having on the website. It can be search traffic, people searching for your brand, searching for a specific product, buying from there, people clicking on a search ad. And it can also be branded traffic on search, for example, so that being traffic where your market, your brand keyword is added into the mix, into the targeting. And because of that, it's basically called branded. What you can also have is you can have all these different social channels. They're really common. For example, you can have TikTok, you can have Pinterest, Facebook, etc. And then last but not least, and this one is one that a lot of people actually miss. And because they're missing it, they're just missing out on a lot of results that they otherwise would be able to get. And that specific channel that I'm talking about here is brick and mortar. Now, if that doesn't apply to you, you can probably skip the next 30 seconds of this video. But if you have offline sales channels, or if you have any sort of other sales channels that aren't directly on your website, that can be Amazon, that can be eBay, etc., etc. The thing with those is obviously those channels are being affected by your overall marketing activity. And that's something that can actually be tracked through a variety of means. And what you can do once you have that is you can essentially go ahead and add a percentage value to your purchase value based on it, where you can be in a situation where okay, someone buys in my online store, and then based off that, I know XYZ amount of purchases are happening in these other channels that I'm having as well. And the thing with those is that they are being impacted heavily by each other, not just the offline channels, but these multi-channels in general. And what it means, for example, is direct traffic. People can share an ad with their friend. They can basically click on an ad, but then not buy directly from that ad. And then later that day, their friend or themselves can go to your website, type the URL in because they remember it, and then purchase from that. And if you look at your Google Analytics or whatever tracking dashboard or software you're using, it's most likely going to show up as direct traffic. And the problem with that showing up as direct traffic is that these purchases wouldn't be happening without the ad impression that's happening before. Also, the same goes for these things that get triggered by general brand awareness, where, for example, branded traffic, people wouldn't actually be searching for your brand in the first place if it wouldn't be for these other channels. And you just need to be very mindful of this, and you need to assign these percentage values to each of those channels based on what makes sense, considering how your marketing budget is distributed and how channels work. Just to give you an example, what I mean by this is that if you advertise mainly on Facebook and your only traffic source is Facebook, maybe there's some TikTok ads in there as well. But for simplicity's sake, let's just say it's only Facebook. Something that is going to happen is all of your sales are happening because you're advertising on Facebook, because there's not simply any other activity. So this is a very obvious example where if you would go ahead and you would look at Google Analytics, there is going to be direct traffic, there is going to be email traffic, there's going to be search traffic, there's not going to be any branded keywords because in that example, we're not going to in Google ads. But when maybe you have an offline channel as well on which you're not advertising, so literally the only revenue driver you have is Facebook. Well, obviously 100% of these purchases are happening because of Facebook, and things should be treated accordingly. Now, in reality, it's usually a bit more complex because there's multiple channels involved, but the general gist is that with each of these channels, you have to think about, okay, what percentage is realistically of these numbers impacted by other platforms, and how can I make sure I'm tracking this in a way that's appropriate? So that's the first bit. Another one is the attribution windows. What is an attribution window? Just to give you an example, the most commonly used one, and I think that's a big mistake that a lot of people are making and they're just not aware of it, it's costing them money every single day, is that in Facebook, they have the 7-day click, 1-day view attribution window. And the problem with this specific attribution window is that someone can click, and then if they purchase 7 days later, it's going to show up in the ads manager, assuming they can actually track your purchase after the iOS update. So that's option one. Because it also has 1-day view in it, it means if someone gets the ad impression and they wind up purchasing within 24 hours after receiving the impression, what's going to happen is, assuming Facebook can track it, it is going to show up. The same thing goes for any kind of social media marketing network, TikTok, Pinterest, etc., because it does make sense to look at views with them to an extent, but something that can be happening and what is a really big risk is that the view percentage can be unreasonably high, and you can drastically be overdoing things. It can drastically overestimate the performance that you're getting. I remember the specific client that we have where we took on the account. They were thinking they were doing crazy good on Facebook. We launched the first campaigns, was even better. But the problem with it was that once we actually went ahead and we looked at the ratio between views and clicks, we noticed it just didn't make any sense because 60% of these purchases were basically coming from views, versus only 40% were coming from clicks. So that's just unreasonable to expect that that's a realistic distribution. Like maybe there is an odd exception here and there, but 99% of the time, this just doesn't make any sense. And you do have to factor it in and make sure that you're looking at this in a realistic way. So that's part one. Part two is that all these networks have different attribution models. And the problem with that is if they have different attribution models, they also have different inaccuracies. They also have all these different things between them. They have these different percentage values. And what you need to have is you actually need to have the same attribution window across all of the advertising channels that you're having. The reason why you want to have that in the first place is because if you aren't doing this, you can't really compare the data that you're actually having. Because what you're trying to do is, if you have multiple marketing channels, you're trying to work something out that is overall true. So if you're not looking at attribution windows with them, you're just going to misdistribute the budget between the advertising channels. And at the end of the day, either you're burning money without wanting it, or being like, you obviously don't want it, but without knowing that you're burning it, or you're being profitable and super profitable without actually knowing that the channel is profitable in the first place. If you look at, for example, these networks, especially with Facebook, they have this issue right now that can't really look at clicks on different time frames on the same entity. So for example, if you have a campaign in there, you want to look at it with a specific time frame, it's not going to show it. However, luckily enough, there's a couple of apps that do implement this, and we're happy to share those. We work with those. Just if you consider becoming a client, reach over to furniture-scale.com, and then we're going to share how specifically this actually would make sense for your business. Moving on to the next point, attribution models. So basically how things are actually being looked at between these different channels. So we do have the percentage values already. However, another thing is the way these channels are looked at beyond that in Google Analytics or within any other tracking software that you may be having. And if you look at it, there's usually a couple different ones that are very popular and they're completely flawed. I'm going to get into what actually makes them flawed in a second. But basically these popular or more common models, so to speak, first click. So this basically means that if someone clicks and they purchase, it's going to show up if the first click came from the channel, and it's not going to show up for any of the other channels. Now, beyond that, you have last click. The thing with last click is that it basically tracks the last channel that brought a click in before the purchase happened, and that's where things get attributed. And then in addition to that, you have linear. And linear is, let's say you have 5 different touch points, clicks on a Google ad, they click on a Facebook ad, they're being retargeted on Pinterest, and then they happen to be in your newsletter already, or they signed up in any of these touch points, and then they purchase for the newsletter. What's going to happen is all of these channels are going to get an equal share of the purchase. Now, the problem with that is that there's channels that obviously have a heavier weight in bringing in that purchase. For example, the email, it actually wouldn't be happening if the person wouldn't be on the website in the first place. Same thing kind of goes for the retargeting campaign that I mentioned. If someone has come to your website and they wind up being shown additional ads afterwards and you can target them this way, something that is going to happen is a lot of times people buy from these, but again, they wouldn't be on the website and a lot of these people would be buying anyways. So what you need beyond this multi-channel percentage value thing and the attribution windows is an additional model that shows you how the user journey gets valued. So if someone comes from Facebook in the first place, it's not a remarketing campaign. It's completely first impression that they're having from your business, right? Or at least the first click that they're doing towards your website. It should be valued higher, and then the other one should be valued lower according. That's the basic gist. In reality, that's something that can get quite complex. Again, based on the marketing mix that you're having, can be something that can be too flawed, and because like it's an oversimplified model, it's really tricky to do this, and it has to be monitored over a longer time frame. If you're not actually able to monitor it over a longer time frame, it's not something that I would recommend doing. The Other thing with these models and assigning these percentage values, at least as far as I'm aware, Google Analytics becomes a little bit too limited. But not only that, it also doesn't actually recognize IP addresses. So it's also limited in that regard. So you can't assign the percentage values, and maybe you can do that. I'm not 100% sure. But in addition, you can not recognize IP addresses. So basically, if someone gets an impression, then purchases from a different device that can't be directly linked to an account on a specific platform, you do run into issues because you're just looking at the clicks that are actually happening and how they're being traced on the same device. So it can't really recognize this cross-device thing unless there's an account that someone is being logged into, et cetera, et cetera. And because that is the case, at the end of the day, just not as much control as you could be having. In addition to this, one thing that also really matters is the percentage value of new customers. It's relatively obvious if you think about it because, well, you can reactivate customers, for example, through email, and it's the main channel that usually drives that. But for example, a retargeting campaign to purchasers, well, those people, they're buying from emails mainly and them getting the impression, maybe it makes a small difference, but it's not really something that is worthwhile. But then also what can happen because it's all this inaccuracy is people can actually target existing customers without knowing. And it's something that's just very, very dangerous because you're selling to an existing customer. You think that existing customer is a new customer. Based on that, you assign a specific value to that customer and you think you're doing well. And then, well, you're just burning through a bunch of money without actually being aware of it. So what you want to do is, in addition to this, you want to be aware of the percentage of new customers. You also want to be aware of the lifetime value. And the reason that you need to make decisions based on the lifetime value, or at least in most cases that makes sense, and what makes it so exciting is that if you can actually look at how much a customer is worth over any given point in time, and you can make decisions over that, and ideally the longer the time frame you can look at better, something that is going to happen is that you are able to outspend your competitors. And because you're able to outspend your competitors, there's a bunch of powerful things happening here. One is you're able to outspend them. So by default, you should be getting more ad impressions than them. So you should be building your brand quicker and stronger than your competitors. Another thing is you should be getting higher order volume and higher revenue numbers. Because you're selling more units, you can get better negotiation power with suppliers. So you can either get better payment terms, but in terms of when you pay, but actually how much you pay per unit as well. So that's part two. And then part three with this is generally, if people are advertising very comparable offers at any given point in time on any given platform, and one person is able to spend slightly more, what's going to happen is that that other person is not going to be able to spend at all. Because what actually happens on a day-to-day level on these platforms is there are auctions. And an auction is only won by the person who can spend the most, right? So when you can spend the most on a purchase, all factors being equal, you also should be able to spend the most per impression. You also should be able to spend the most per click. And because of that, you can basically drive your competitor out of business over time if they don't re-innovate. Another one is understanding the inaccuracy. You're probably aware of this. Sometimes there's over attribution, sometimes there's under attribution. And it's something that can make it very tricky to actually make proper decisions because I mentioned this before. You think you're doing great, you're not. You think you're doing poor, you're not. And your map is just off. You're stuck in the forest, can't get to the destination you want. But if you're actually able to have proper control over it, completely different story. You can you can be very accurate with the direction you're going in. You can be very accurate with the decisions you're making. Not 100% accurate, but it's something that is really, really powerful to have because it also takes a little bit of time to develop this. This is not something that can be developed instantly. This is something that actually takes a little bit of time. And the benefit of that as well is it serves as an additional competitive advantage for you and your company because not everyone is able to do this. Not everyone is able to understand this. And because they're not able to understand it, over time, you should be able to outcompete them if all the factors are equal. And there's various methods that we use with our clients in order to account for all these different variables. We have given you like a rough overview, but what exact percentage does make sense in what specific case for what specific variable, what specific lifetime value time frame makes sense, how to actually understand what percent of customers is coming. This is something that would be too much in detail and too complex in order to cover in this video. However, something that we do is we do have the service where we implement this for clients, we monitor this over time, we make sure it's accurate for them, and they can make the most accurate decisions possible. And if you're interested in this, in implementing any of these ideas that we talked about, if you have additional questions of any of the stuff that I just covered in this video, just head over to furniture-scale.com and apply for a free consultation. If you think we can actually help you and that this is something that actually has utility for your company, we're going to go ahead and schedule the free consult. And in that, we're going to give you sort of a step-by-step plan in regards to what actually makes sense for your specific company, for your specific marketing mix, with your specific products, with your specific lifetime value, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a very clear overview and you're going to have a clear plan of what is going to make sense in order to finally get control over your tracking again.